Tim Sinclair, hello. Hello, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes for people to trickle in. Who's listed as SIG Release right now?
That's me. Sorry, I will fix that.
No, it's all good. All right, let's get rolling. For those who are on the call, feel free to pop your names into the Google Doc. I just popped that in the chat. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the May 7th edition of SIG Release. This is a meeting that is recorded and posted on YouTube, so please be mindful of what you say. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. So we don't have, we've got kind of a short agenda today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was project boards. So I have combed through some of the SIG release backlog and done a soft prioritization of some of the open tasks that we have right now. I will say that it is quite a bit. We do have quite a bit on the backlog. So any sub-project owner, release team, member, release engineering, licensing sub-project, I want to request that you work on making sure that your backlog is up to date and start to actively groom the tasks that are in your project board for each of your meetings, right? So you'll see that there are 4 project boards there. There's a top level SIG release project board, a release team project board, a release engineering one, and a licensing one. So licensing wise, we're also going to start our licensing sub-project meetings this week. I believe Friday looks like the best day for the doodle. Initially, I want to make sure that it's a meeting that myself, Nikita, Dims, and Steve Winslow can attend. And then moving forward, I think after KubeCon, we can shift the schedule to make it more convenient for everyone. So if you have interest in how we handle licensing, scanning, and all that good stuff on the project, and then remediate those things, feel free to join those meetings. I'll be sending a meeting invite out to the mailing list a little later in the day. Okay, next item is Nico. If Nico's here, I'm not sure if he's here. He's actually not here. All right.
I didn't think we were gonna get him just because isn't it midnight in his time zone?
Time zones, maybe what time zone is he on?
Europe-ish.
Europe-ish. Fish. Yeah, so it's at least 10 his time. Yeah, so maybe not. 11 p.m. Thank you, Arno. All right. So at the very least, what I'd like is for people to take a look at these issues. There have been a variety of discussions around how we do issue triage, and that kind of leads into like why we start needing, like why we need project boards. So Nico has been working as a bug triage lead and shadow for previous release cycles. And he's kind of collated a lot of the notes that he's found based on working through that process and working through updates to the handbooks. So please take a look at the some of the ideas that he has. I think that one of the immediate things that we can action on is the adding the need SIG triage automation to Kubernetes issues. So that would basically add a new label to the currently open issues and new issues that would be need SIG triage, right? So essentially the idea, if you click the second link in that note, it kind of goes through the workflow. So essentially a PR would get opened, tagged as need SIG and need SIG triage. Need SIG already happens today. Need SIG triage would give a little signal to SIGs who are trying to work through their backlog of what needs to be triaged next. And then we're going to be looking at, we as in, I think we as a community, but more specifically, I guess we as PM and contributor experience are going to be looking at adding or essentially recategorizing the triage labels that currently exist right now. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, please put them on those issues.
One of the things that I'd worry about in I think this was on the Contribex mailing list, there was the discussion there that led to this issue in the proposed workflow. It feels gappy as one SIG looks at something and triages it and maybe hands it off to another SIG. And this came up today. The release team was talking about how they're trying to pull together release notes a little more clearly. And one of the things that they'd struggled with is when things have multiple SIGs listed.
Who's the owning, right? Like who's the real owning?
Exactly. And so yes, your SIG is labeled because it's relevant, but you're passing it off to somebody. And my worry was that it ends up having like a need SIG dash star dash triage family of labels or something. And like even just the suggestion of adding primary SIG already,
it feels
there's a slippery slope here, and I'm not sure that it solves the situation adding more labels.
Yeah, I don't think primary SIG or multiple SIGs is the right direction. I think that I think that if we have the opportunity to triage something like this, I think this is inherent of a problem that like we're not doing enough triage, right? So I think that anyone who does grab it, I think it's first dibs. If they decide that it doesn't belong to their SIG, or they decide that the owning SIG should be something else, then we can look at relabeling or something like that. But I think just putting this label in place will allow SIGs to get some sort of signal out of the backlog, right? This is also this is also assuming that someone who comes along and does that initial either the creation of the issue or the initial like soft prioritization of the thing, right, can determine what it is, right? So if it's a PR,
as long as it's got needs triage, everybody who's got a SIG label on it it should be showing up in their list of backlog. Yeah,
right.
And I guess they somehow flag not it in a comment and self-choose how to ignore it somehow.
Yeah, I don't know like what we do in that little gap there.
Yeah, my worry is that for some people in their workflows, they're going to end up with more on their list of things to sift through instead of less.
Yeah. I also, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because I think with there may also be issues that are just missing SIG labels in general, right?
Yeah.
And at that point, who's going to be the person to triage it?
Now, I may be overly skeptical on this just because the patch release PRs, the cherry picks that come by, the vast majority of them have multiple SIGs. So I'm used to having to just guess what's going on. And
Yeah.
I don't see these as helping me confirm where it stands.
So I think that, part of it is like definitely separating between the issues and the PRs themselves, right? Because like with PRs, we have the opportunity to auto label the PRs based on the code that they're touching, right?
That's true. Yeah.
Whereas for the issues, we're almost like depending on either the issue filer or someone who does that initial prioritization or initial triage to determine what SIG it belongs to, right?
That's fair. I guess on the PR side, SIGs are going to be labeled based on owners' files, and where I'm trying to understand who has and who hasn't looked at the situation.
Yeah.
Prow is kind of giving me some hints on that in the comments.
And
So
then it also,
if it's
yeah,
an
sorry,
issue, it doesn't matter so much maybe then, as long it bounces around until somebody, until it should converge
at some point, hopefully,
at some
right?
point.
Yeah. We have Tim Sinclair on the call, and SIG cluster
Yeah,
lifecycle has had
I was
some
wondering.
success in grooming. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on this, Tim.
We have a separate repo though. It's not in the main KDK. Because we have a separate repo, it's visible for us to easily do that. And everything that gets PR'd in gets the labels applied through the orders files and notified that way. So from an issue perspective, it's a non-issue because we have a separate repo. And every 6 months or so, we comb through KK for anybody who filed kubeadm things, and we close them all out or force them to be refiled or cross-referenced.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't actually um, we don't regularly maintain KK because most of the people know to go to the separate repo.
To go straight for the kubeadm repo, right, or cluster API or some such. Yeah, that's a good point. So I think I had mentioned it on the PM meeting earlier today, but not here. And where we're at is we've got a lot of issues to burn through, and a lot insofar as like there were about 60 that I was aware of between the release and the SIG release repos, and that I know are in some state of activity, and then 60 to 70 more within Kubernetes that a lot of which I have not seen before, right? So this is like a real real problem. So I really do want the sub project leads to try to be as vigilant as possible in burning some of this stuff down. And Claire at this point has heard this like 3 times. She's been in all of the meetings that I've mentioned. So questions, comments, thoughts, general thoughts. All right. Well, I'm not sure who all is going to Barcelona, but be aware that we have 2 sessions in Barcelona. Well, technically 3 sessions, right? We have the release team meeting during the contributor summit. That's the morning session. And then the intro, the SIG release intro, which will be, I believe, Tim and Claire doing a rundown of the release team. And then a deep dive session, which will be myself and Tim doing a rundown of release engineering and the evolution of release engineering for SIG release. So, cool. So now, I mean, we kind of burned through those topics quickly. Anybody have open mic? Anybody want to?
What's the high level focus for SIG release for like if you were to break up either major sub project initiatives or SIG release initiatives? I'm namely interested in the infra working group of being able to publish things. What are
Right.
the what are the major initiatives for SIG release?
So the continuing initiative for at least one of our sub-projects release team is to automate as much as possible, right, and make whoever's on the release team's life as easy as possible. And I think a lot of that lends to the release engineering team that is slowly spinning up. So between the people who hold the roles of branch managers and patch release management, building up the processes around how we release Kubernetes. And then, as you said, Tim, super high priority for us is figuring out how to package, publish, stamp any artifact that comes out of that release process.
In more concrete terms, I've got a to-do to create a backlog for the release engineering subproject, specific actions and things in conjunction with the working group on infra. At this point, the infra stuff has been slow enough that I want to just kind of decouple from that for the time being.
Yeah.
Just if it's a pipeline of individual tools that do their parts, eventually the pipeline will land on the formal infrastructure, but we can start proving out the individual parts as unique components in the meantime without that.
So, Tim, there is already a project board for release engineering. I think we should at some point sit down and get an official meeting scheduled, or tag on to the Kate's Infra team meetings, and see if we can push it that way. But yeah, we should sit down at least together and do a prioritization of some of those tasks.
One of the things that's been a bit murky since you're here, Tim, and some of the others on the call, initially as this was being discussed months ago, I feel like we kind of split in what felt maybe at the time as natural, but I'm not sure it is natural versus unnatural, a distinction between publishing falling to SIG release and release engineering, and packaging falling to cluster lifecycle. So there were a variety of KEPs that were proposed, and cluster lifecycle was looking at some Go-based tooling to build packages, but I feel like that's evolved some, and I wonder if we should discuss that breakout a little more.
Sure. I don't really care. I'd rather not own it, to be honest. But I do think that there's some requirements that we should put on the artifact generation
For sure. I think you all in cluster lifecycle are first and foremost aware of what tends to be a requirement. So definitely.
So we're already, Travis has already started to work on it. He's here. So I already talked with him. There was other people that were working on it from SUSE, and Travis is currently tasked with working on some of the stuff. So the initial idea is to port over a good chunk of what is currently in the release repository for the canonical pieces, but then we're going to modify some of the basilisms that currently exist to get them out of the way and put it underneath the build directory. The way it's currently done in KK is a little over basilized for everyone's liking. It does this massive generation stuff, and that's too much. So we're just simplifying it, and there's 3 parts to this whole process. That's the first part. Hold on one second. I actually wrote it down earlier today. Do you remember what the second part was? My brain is oatmeal right now.
I should be able to find it, but yeah, this is the reason I joined.
Yeah, part two is to clean up the packaging itself. They're not really canonical packages. They're very much an ad hoc mess. Then part 3 was to work with the release team, subproject, or whatever, to actually get the dev stable and nightly artifact generation.
I have kind of a question around this, especially Tim, since you said you don't care if SCL or SIG Cluster Lifecycle owns it. So I want to make sure that I'm active in the right area. After we gather requirements and all that kind of stuff, where should I be vocal and making sure people see what we're proposing and how to do it? so that the right eyes land on it and who has ownership of it?
We'll probably be in the owner's files for sure. I think it'll be like just like everything else in KK. Owner's files are the curation of people who work on the stuff and people who've actively been engaged in it. So I think if the owner's file is populated with the cross-functional group of people in SIG cluster lifecycle and the release team, I think that's perfect. That's what it should be.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, I think what Travis was alluding to is like, what meetings should I actually go to talk about this stuff? And I think that it's looking like we should either be tacking on to the Kate's Infra meetings or adding a release engineering meeting.
I think Kate's Infra might be a little bit of a bike shed for a while. So
I agree. I'd like to keep us moving forward separate from that.
Okay. All right. So let's plan to.
Not that I'm keen on a separate meeting, but yeah.
Yay, more meetings. So let's plan to do another meeting, and maybe we or Travis, will you be at KubeCon?
I will not this time around.
No. All right.
I'm one of the few.
Yeah, I was figuring we can do an in-person sync or something, but let's plan to start those meetings the week after KubeCon, if not the week after that. So everyone's kind of like settled back down. I know Tim and I are definitely like under the gun to put together slides and all that good stuff. So, and I think at this point we can consolidate some of the keps that are floating around between SCL and release. And I think there's a plan for like an omni kep to describe all of this stuff, because right now it's broken down into individual pieces, which I think it does need to be, but there needs to be another kep describing the overall vision of what's going to happen.
And the other thing that I think is missing, Tim, from your 3 phases, those 3 steps are focused very much on mechanism, and while the mechanism here is quite poor, has a lot of room for improvement, the mechanism choices do need to support specific types of policy, and we haven't had a lot of discussion on the policy side of things as well.
With regards to what?
A simple one that comes up all the time is dependencies. So do we put dependency equals version number? Do we put dependency greater than equals version number? Do we put dependency name without a version number? Do we pick a version number? Is it the least common denominator or the highest preferred? All of those policy choices.
Oh, that's pretty simple if we actually set the repo properly and not have this weird unified repo. It would usually standard policy
will mostly go away, yeah. But
standard policy for
go ahead.
Standard policy for packaging would pin the version associated with the release. They sometimes have downgrade capabilities, but the best practice is always to pin, because that's the one that's been vetted. And that's the only thing we actually do with KK. So I don't think we can actually have anything other than that. The only reason why we do anything different is because of our weird unirepo inside of our release mechanism. Because what gets vetted is what we should release. And that we only vet a very specific pinned version.
I agree with what is vetted should be released, yeah. And if we're lucky, the symptoms of the problems we've had on the client side consuming the packages have been very surprising to me. I do think it's likely that those are primarily caused by the weird layout of the contents within our server-side repositories, but I'm not convinced by that. So I think we need to do some experimentation to validate that.
That's totally opaque to me. I have no insight into like how that is stored or maintained. I could do an experiment. We could do experiments external to it, or just stand up our own.
Yep, exactly. It's easy to do. It's easy to create and test and play and verify. And then within that, Go
Here's
ahead.
a question for us, which I don't know the answer to. Would it be, instead of us actually hosting these things on our own infra, there's plenty of hosting services to do multi-package things. Like CNCF is loaded with cache. Like, and we have this weird tendency to like build our own infra for our infra sake. It, would people be fine with like me putting out a request to the CNCF to say like, let's just pay some hosted provider offering and set it up that way and put some alias there?
In terms of just the storage bucket where the things live?
Well, to actually set up legit, not just a storage bucket, but to set up like legit repositories. Not this weird, repository through a storage bucket. But a lot of them have like, well-defined structures for how they expect the repositories to be laid out.
Yeah, so I've presumed that part of solving this on our side is for us to declare what our structure is going to be. I think across providers and repos that are out there, there's a lot of different examples of how people choose to run these themselves for their reasons. What we choose to do should be done for reasons. There's multiple things that we could choose to do, and what we're doing right now is a mishmash of them and does not make sense. So I'd like to see a discussion of what is the sense, what do we want to provide, and then that quickly gets messy because we have users who are wanting to do things that seem unnatural with respect to those repositories.
I think that, I think that Tim's point of Tim Sinclair specifically, Tim's point of having a service that provides this for us would be kind of awesome. Especially if it imposes or enforces structure, right? Structure that we don't have right now. It's definitely like one of the options. I think that something else to consider is staffing in general, right? The idea of branch management right now, exists scoped within quarterly cycles, right, for every release, right? And then afterwards the idea of patch release, right? It used to just be one person, right? And we're working on this idea of having a team, right? But it's still, I think staffing is still a concern, right? So if we have the expectation of, right now, I think it's 3 to 4 to 5 people maybe that can actually execute on cutting a Kubernetes release, right? Or have the access to do that right now. We need to build something that's more scalable, first and foremost. Is that a wild idea?
That's always the problem. Who's going to do it? So my intention is to work on behalf of the release engineering sub-project to define a specific set of actions that line up to improve this over a period of time. Build up effectively a straw man, because I think out of the set of things I hear people saying they want from our published artifacts, it's difficult to provide all of them. And whatever I help stand up is going to include some bit of opinionated choice within that. But my hope would be to stand up something that, as an example, could be shown to be sufficiently equivalent to what we do today for some core use cases, and for the ones that are explicitly not captured, that the people that care about them could choose to staff and build out as incremental changes then those types of support mechanism and policy. But I imagine us showing something that is sufficient enough to say, okay, let's turn down the other one. And then that'll start some conversations, because it's going to mean some people are broken.
Yeah, for sure. I think an additional problem that we have is going to be communication, right? When these people break, right? How do we communicate that to them, or how do we preempt some of that pain, right?
One of the core tenets, I think, for this new system as we stand it up, that each of these individual components that build something, it needs to be defining what it is supposed to be publishing to a place and what the state of that should be. So even if we use a hosting provider that's imposing some structure on us, we need to have a priori decided what is supposed to be where and have tests that are monitoring for that, so that when we accidentally don't publish just the kubelet binary, we know that ahead of time and it's not somebody downloading it. And we need to add tests for each of the outputs along the way to show that they are consumable.
Cool, cool. All right, we got a shy group this week.
Or we all agree with you.
What? So I fall back to that staffing thing. I think that, you know, in terms of sub-project owners who are currently in release engineering, we have maybe 5 to 6, maybe they're not all of the appropriate people. Do we want to further segment that group of people to break between who's doing patch, who's doing what? Should it still be a big blob of the same people, and we figure out who else is interested in potentially working on this effort? I know that there's some interest internally at VMware, but we want to make sure that this is shared with the community. So if anyone on this call is also interested in this effort, we need to start considering what else would be involved. Okay, this will be a hot topic for Barcelona.
Everybody's just going to wait until the implementation's there, and basically the people who are around agreed that it's good and we're ready to turn it live, and they're all going to freak out.
Like, wait, but we had that idea. Yeah, I mean, I think we're.
This is fine.
Yeah, I think we're long overdue at this point. As I was combing through our backlog, I think I caught an issue from Joe from maybe like late 2006 or early 2007. That's like, move all of the build infrastructure out of Google. Stop building Google container. Like all of these issues that, I mean, we're circling back on 2 years later. So like it's overdue. It's overdue.
When the current one works enough and is understood just barely enough to keep limping along, it's hard for people to get excited about going and replacing it. But at some point, somebody's got to show up with a replacement so that we have a concrete example of something to talk about.
Yep. All right. Well, I don't have anything else personally. Is anybody else interested in talking about any topics before we close this out? Give you a bunch of time back. All right, so I will say it once more. We really do need continued help and effort around knocking down a lot of the stuff on these project boards. So if there are things marked as help wanted, or there are things that you're currently assigned to that you're no longer interested in working, feel free to give them up. Feel free to tag them as needing help. And as usual, if there are things in the milestone that need working on, feel free to jump in. Thank you everyone who showed up today. Thank you everyone who contributed to the conversation. This will be up shortly, and have a great rest of your day.